You're listening to 9 Plus, a research podcast from Waterford Institute of Technology. Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the 9 Plus podcast from WIT. This podcast is where we discuss some of the research activities going on in the Institute, chat to some of the people involved and get a sense as to what happens in the general world of research. My name is Rob O'Connor. I'm with the Department of Computing and Mathematics, but if you think it's all going to be technology talk, you are mistaken. We'll be aiming to cover as wide an area as possible, taking in as many disciplines as we can. So yes, there'll be science, but there'll also be humanities. There will be technology, but there'll also be agriculture and business. Often the disciplines will meet and intersect, such as when we talk to some of the agri-tech researchers later in the series. Sometimes the research discussed will be abstract, and other times it'll be more applied. I guess the point of this preamble is that one size does not fit all, and we want to reflect that here by having, hopefully, interesting conversations. You don't need to be a researcher to listen to this podcast. In fact, I kind of hope you're not. I hope that you're somebody who's just curious and wants to learn a bit about the stuff that goes on here at WIT. Perhaps you want to hear the personal stories about what motivates researchers. Or maybe, just maybe, you'd be interested in becoming involved yourself. For the first episode, I sat down with the new head of research at WIT, Dr. Geraldine Canny, to talk about her own research journey. Geraldine joined WIT in 2021. She holds a degree in biotechnology from NUIG and a PhD in immunology from UCD. In America, she worked with the Brigham Women's Hospital in Boston before transferring to the Harvard Medical School. She subsequently moved to Switzerland and worked with the Lausanne University Hospital, where she established a research program on endometriosis and endometrial biology. That's a roundabout way of saying that Geraldine is an incredibly accomplished individual and knows what she's talking about. Unlike me, I'll be 100% straight, I haven't got a clue about most of the topics that will be discussed during these podcasts. I'm here to ask the obvious questions and hopefully make the material a little bit more understandable for the average Joe or Josephine Soap. In my conversation with Geraldine, we spoke about her own professional journey, and she was quite candid about not always knowing what moves she should make next and how she should progress her own career. We also discussed her work on endometriosis, which I didn't realise was a condition that affects around 10% of the female population, which is a staggering figure. So let's begin. I started the conversation with Geraldine by asking her to describe her current role at WIT.
I am head of research at WIT. I've been working here since May 2021, so 6 months now or so. And in this role, I'm responsible for overseeing research at, you might say, a high level, where we talk about compliance and policy and regulations. Are we doing things correctly? But also in the doing of research, we need funding for that. And as we become a technological university, it's very important that we build capacity. We have more people, we have more skills across all areas of research. And for that, we need money, we need research funding. So part of that is supporting people to write grants and to bring in more research funding so we have more people doing research. It's also really important that we're doing it correctly, that we're doing it according to ethical frameworks, research integrity, and we're thinking of researchers of different types at different career stages. Actually, in my job, I recently organised with my colleague Jo Holohan the Research Excellence Awards. And that was wonderful because as a newcomer to the institution, it gave me the opportunity to appreciate the diverse and excellent research we carry out at WIT in very different areas and in very important areas that are relevant to society, to life.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a very broad question. Now, it's a very low level, but it's equally a very high level question. What is research?
To me, research is the investigation and addressing important questions where we generate new knowledge. Why do I say new knowledge? Well, firstly, the best research is innovative. It's bringing something new to the field, it's bringing a new angle, but it's also rigorous. it's done correctly. We have the appropriate controls, the appropriate methodologies, the appropriate ways of asking the question and of analysing any data that we generate. So to me, research is discovery, it's novelty, it's about a journey. It's about a journey because when we start research, we learn something, and we also sometimes have to learn from our mistakes how we can do it better. What's important is that we do it well, we do it as we should, we involve whom we should, we respect those with whom we're working, be they stakeholders, end users, patients, and that we also generate something. So typically in research, often a publication is what we call an output. And it's very important for researchers' careers. That's the currency on which they build their career largely. It's not the only one, but it's important that people know what we do and that we publish it, but also that we communicate about it to the public. CalMast here at WIT really does a lot of training and activities in bringing research closer to the public, the taxpayer.
So would I be correct in saying a lot of it comes from curiosity?
Absolutely.
How does that work? Why does this behave this way? How could this be done better? Questions like that. And then it can be in whatever field, doesn't matter whatever field it is. And then the researcher, research team or group, whoever it is, sits down and tries to figure out some way of answering those questions. And then the publication that you mentioned is when they say, well, this is what we found out. And then that is put out there into the world where other researchers or other peers can read it or consume it and perhaps even test it out themselves and see, is that consistent? And would that be a fair description? I know it's a very broad description.
It would be a fair description. I would just add that...
That's a very scientific view now, by the way. I know that. I know that's not the only way.
I would just add perhaps that it's important it's done the right way, involving all the different controls and tests, but also that publications are peer reviewed.
Yes.
You can't just put a publication out there. It needs to go through an evaluation process by other people, and then that's put out there. They're also talking about that who your reviewers are. They were talking about open science a lot more because it's important that that knowledge, there's a transfer of knowledge to the public and to all the different stakeholders as well. But, that's largely correct, Rob. I agree with you.
So when we're talking about peer review, let's say I did some tests, right? I'm in computing and I did some networking tests or something like that, and I came up with some sort of a finding about 5G networks, right? Whatever it is, okay? And I published it, but it's peer reviewed, and people who are knowledgeable in the field would be able to look at my data and say, well, hang on, those figures don't look real. And then when they looked into it, they figure out, actually, he just made up those figures, because they would be able to read that. Whereas you've a biotechnology background, you might know what those figures are in the same way that I would know what a biotechnology figures look like, or what would be valid data or not. And that way then we can ensure that there is a quality control on the work that is published. Is that fair enough?
That's absolutely right, Rob, because there is knowledge in research. One becomes a master of a very specific area. And as you say, 5G telecommunications is totally different to what I might do in biotechnology, molecular biology, endometriosis research. So that's very important. And it's true that scientific misconduct is a problem, because if people make up data or take away some data and publish the story that they want to publish, that does a disservice to the taxpayer. And it is true that even some very prominent researchers this has been found out about them. Someone investigates it and they're forced to retract the publication. Yeah. Which is obviously something of a scandal for them. It has negative impacts on their career, on that of their institution. Some top institutions in the world have had that happen to some of their scientists. Yeah, there's some open your search engine and you'll find some complete howlers about that one. Geraldine, we might actually just talk about your own story for a moment as to how you ended up here, because you're not originally from Waterford, you're originally from Galway, is that correct? I suppose I'm a citizen of the world, really, Rob. Okay. I sometimes ask myself, where am I from? I was born in Dublin and I grew up in County Galway. Okay. But I spent, after my PhD, so in Dublin, in UCD, I went to Boston, to Harvard Medical School, to do my postdoc.
Let's go back a little bit further to that.
Okay.
So let's Geraldine Canny is going to college for the first time. What do you do?
Right. I did a bachelor's in a BSc in biotechnology at NUIG Galway.
Okay.
That was a 4-year course.
Okay, so biotechnology. You obviously had an interest in science. You had an interest in biology, chemistry, technology. I don't really know too much about biotechnology, so if I say something incorrect, please pick me up on it, okay? You go from there, and then say you're coming to the end of your degree. You would have done some kind of a project or some sort of work in your final year, I'm assuming. Would that be correct?
Absolutely, and it was an important part of my journey as a 4th-year undergraduate. I actually did a lab project and a literature project, and both of them touched on immunology, which is the study of the immune system. And the lab project I did actually in the Department of Pharmacology in NUIG Galway, and I was working on an enzyme, which is a bit like a biological scissors in rat brain. So rats that were stressed, and it was of relevance to a domain called psychoneuroimmunology, which is actually about how cytokines affect emotions, how some cytokines get across the blood-brain barrier. And I was looking at some enzymes. And I was recently talking with Professor John Nolan about something, and he was mentioning some of the same enzymes because they're involved in mopping up free radicals. By life, we actually produce free radicals as part of our metabolism, and there are these enzymes that break them up, that chop them up, and so they don't do as much damage to our cells and our tissues. And that's part of what I mean about my journey. I knew that then. I've learned so much more, but yet I can look at a paper or hear an interview today and I'm thinking, that enzyme, catalase. Well, the first time I came across that was in my 4th-year research project. So for me, that was a pivotal moment. It sparked my interest in research. I actually went on to work for a while in a company, but the questioning, the curiosity was still there. And I knew I wasn't entirely fulfilled. And so I decided I was also mentored by someone. We'll come back to that. Someone advised me when I wasn't sure about what I was going to do. A friend of mine who I still know and I'm friends with, I really appreciated her input to me at the time. Her advice was, you know what? You're bright, you've a questioning mind, consider research. And so I applied for a few PhDs and then I went on to do my PhD at UCD, Dublin.
Okay, and what did you do there? So a PhD is a doctorate. A doctorate,
basically.
So that's where you were going to be a researcher full-time working towards a doctorate qualification.
That's right.
And what were you doing there?
Well, my project was funded by the Health Research Board at the time. It's one of our Irish funding bodies. So the professor had funding and I was paid by that.
I'll just qualify you there for a second, just because I think this is important, particularly if somebody who's not familiar with research. When you're saying it's funded, you got paid to do this.
Precisely, I did.
So it's not like you were an undergraduate student and you were working part-time in, SPAR or something like that. Or maybe you were, I don't know. But you were paid and your fees were paid, and there might have been a budget for some travel or for equipment and maybe other materials that you might have needed for your research. Would that be correct?
That's right. So a funded project is where a student is either paid by a project that has been awarded to their supervisor, who's their mentor, who trains them, who's responsible for overseeing. And typically nowadays in a structured PhD, you have maybe 3 supervisors, and that's good. It's good because you have a diverse group of people feeding into your development, your training and your research path and development. In this case, it paid so either a research project or a scholarship. Scholarships are competitive, but they all pay your salary. They pay the fees for you to do the PhD, which is a certain amount that has to be paid to the university or IOT or to you every year. And then also consumables, which, pipettes or plastics or antibodies or chemicals that, because it costs money. And that's how it works. So I was paid to do this job and I was working full time. I'm aware that some people do a PhD part-time while they're also working. In the lab sciences, I would have found that challenging personally because you have to do all the work in the lab. You have to analyse it. You then have to write up your papers and your thesis. But I was working full-time, It was great at UCD. Okay,
so sorry now to interrupt you. I interrupted your flow about describing your PhD work, but I just wanted to get that in there about the funding, just to qualify what that was. So what did you do then in your PhD work?
My PhD was basically about looking at the immune function and molecules made by epithelial cells and intestinal tissue. So if you think any mucosal surface is in contact with the outside world, the mouth, the intestine, the lungs, the female reproductive tract, they're all what we call mucosal surfaces, and they're very interesting environments because the boundary, the external world, where we have bacteria, viruses, things that can cause us harm, or we can have a wound where that surface is broken, and then the tissue underneath. So if you consider that the intestine is like a pipe, there's a single cell of layers that line that pipe along the length of the intestine, which are called epithelial cells. And they're quite cool cells. They're sort of cuboid in places, they're flatter in other places, but they're an immune cell in their own type. And I was looking at some molecules that they make which increase inflammation, which drive it up, and others, very interestingly, that dampen or decrease inflammation. And I was also getting tissue that was taken with consent from patients and looking at the production of some of the same molecules.
Okay, and then from there, when you finished your PhD, what did you do next?
Well, during my PhD, I got the opportunity to go to Boston, to a lab. We had a connection. And this is another thing important in research. Research is an international endeavour. It involves collaboration. It involves mobility. Very important to see what's done elsewhere. So I was very fortunate in that I got to go abroad to a lab in Boston where I learnt a lot. I stayed there for 6 months. I learned so much and I got a paper out of that, a good publication on something quite interesting. And worked really hard, but the professor there in Boston offered me a postdoc. And so I went back, I finished my PhD, I wrote up my thesis, I did my viva, and then I had started my postdoc before my viva. So the viva is when a student defends their thesis to a panel. There must be an external examiner there who's an expert in the field. And basically they ask you various questions about your thesis to make sure you did the work, it's novel, it was correctly done, with the rigour and the controls needed, and how you might do things differently. They assess, your creativity as well around that, but your expertise. And then you get your PhD, in the ceremony where it's conferred is usually later after that. So basically, I had started my postdoc before that viva in Boston, and there I was working on not the same thing but a continuation. I was still on my path. I was working on antimicrobial peptides and a protein. And basically, what is an antimicrobial molecule? It's something that punches a hole maybe in the outer part of a bacterium. We know a lot less about viruses, as the pandemic has shown us. We know a lot more about antibiotics, even though we really need more novel and effective antibiotics because bacteria are finding out how to evade them all the time. And so there, it's a protein or a peptide that's made in the body, including by epithelial cells, but also by blood cells, that punches a hole typically in a bacterium. That's one main way it does it, and it kills the bacterium. So they're antimicrobial peptides. And I was looking at how they're made by epithelial cells, the molecular biology behind that, how, what makes it so that the protein is made, the antimicrobial protein or peptide, and its importance in inflammatory bowel disease. That's a mucosal intestinal disease that actually is quite debilitating for people.
Now, later on, and you've mentioned it already about endometriosis.
Yes.
That this is where you have done the bulk of your work, or I think you have anyway. What could you maybe describe what is endometriosis first, and then we'll talk about the importance of it?
Sure. Well, firstly, during my postdoc, I started getting interested in the female reproductive tract. Again, I changed, and that's interesting in science, also a little risky, but I changed mucosal surface from the intestine to the female reproductive tract. And I have to say, it's extremely interesting. I don't regret that at all because it's a fascinating area. So then I was looking at antimicrobial peptides there, and then in 2008 or so, I learnt about endometriosis for the first time from a colleague who was a clinician. And I hadn't heard about it prior to that, even though it's very common. It's actually a disease of the womb and surrounding area and what we call the abdomen.
Yep.
And it's basically when, and it affects up to 10% of women of reproductive age. So they estimate that the numbers of women that have endometriosis, it might be up to 176 million women worldwide. And it's a major cause in those women of pain, decreased life quality, pain during sexual intercourse, and infertility. So these women suffer quite a lot. And so I heard about it and I thought, wow, we should investigate that. There aren't any good medications, and the good treatment is drug treatment has a lot of side effects. But the problem is it's a little bit, so it's a tiny bit like cancer in that it involves hormones, it involves inflammation, but it doesn't kill you. But it comes back and it comes back. So what happens is, and this is relevant to women's health and women's lives. So during menstruation, the inner lining, remember I told you about that cell lining inside the intestine?
Yes.
It's similar enough within the womb, the uterus. So there it's epithelial cells and maybe cells around them or some stromal cells, but they're shed every month during the reproductive years of a woman, during menstruation, where they're, it breaks down and they pass out of the body. That's menstruation. The problem, and that's normal. It's perfectly normal when pregnancy doesn't occur. That happens on a monthly basis during the reproductive years of any woman. That's healthy. It's normal. And so what happens in endometriosis is that effluent, so to speak, the cells, etc., it goes against gravity. It goes up and out of the fallopian tubes and into the abdomen. And it can also go elsewhere. And what happens is those cells stick and they form lesions and they grow in other parts of the body. They can attach to the intestine, the bladder. They can invade, a bit like a cancer tumour. And even though endometriosis isn't seen as associated with the same mortality, the function of the intestine can be compromised, the function of the bladder can be compromised, and sometimes women don't have any symptoms. They don't know. And because the diagnosis is a bit complex, sometimes they have symptoms and they don't know it for years. The average delay to a person having first symptoms and diagnosis can be as many as 9 years.
Yes.
So we don't talk enough about endometriosis because it can happen during the teenage years, but sometimes women are suffering. And the surgery, how do you remove these lesions? So these cells have stuck to various areas. They've travelled elsewhere. They're invading. They're kind of invading into another tissue. They're growing, and they grow under the influence of estrogens, female hormones, and immune inflammatory molecules as well. So here, the immune and the endocrine, so the immune system and the hormonal system work in tandem. And so basically the only way to get rid of the lesions is to undergo surgery. But the problem there is that it's invasive and that the lesions, the disease comes back, it recurs. So I know some patients who've had 10 surgeries. And unfortunately, they've had time off work, they suffered a lot. They might take a long time to find a good surgeon because treating this is very complex.
Yes.
Surgeons need to be highly skilled. And so it takes maybe years and it comes back. So you can imagine that it's quite a problem for these women. And
what I know about endometriosis, I'll be honest with you, I didn't even know about it until a number of years ago when, say, me and my friends and people I know started getting into kind of family age, if you know what I mean. We started having our own families. And I wasn't aware of it, but probably maybe because I'm a man, whatever, I don't know, and I'm probably ignorant about these things. But I very quickly realised how common it is. So you say 10%, that's quite a high figure. And it's, as you mentioned, I know people who suffer from endometriosis and they didn't know until they got to the stage where they were either trying to get pregnant or were experiencing fertility issues and pregnancy issues.
Right.
And because when I say it's a low level illness, I don't mean that in terms of a value judgment, but what I mean is that it as you said, it's not life threatening. It is life affecting, but you can function. And that's maybe where it's in a difficult position. Is that, but obviously it becomes very, 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 very important as it goes on then, and really can affect quality of life.
I mean, it's funny when you talk about function. So there are maybe two broad types of patients with endometriosis. The first have very painful periods. They have pain at various times, and they have a manifestation. They have a symptom, and sometimes when pain is chronic, people don't see you walking around with a broken arm. They don't see the effects of that, for example. So they perhaps underestimate the impact on life quality. The second type of person is a person who doesn't know they have endometriosis, but when they try, as you said, to have a baby, they realise, there are infertility issues. They do an invasive visualisation, because that's the only way you can see these lesions, these cells and tissue that stick to other places where they shouldn't. And the only way to see those is by doing an invasive technique technique. So, doctors won't just prescribe that off the bat. It can take a long time. So then, or others have a surgery for another reason in that area of the body around the abdomen, and they say, they notice the lesions there. So it's actually by chance. But it is true that in terms of function, if a person can't have a baby, that essential right and function is compromised.
Yes.
But people don't see that, and maybe they don't realise how much the person's going through.
You're 100% correct. And when I was saying there, I hadn't gathered my thoughts correctly. I don't mean to diminish in any way that it's not serious or anything like that. But what I mean, when you said if somebody has a broken arm, you can see that. If somebody has a cut in their head, you can physically see that. You can't see this. And also you can't see the effect that it has. I would say behind closed doors, but if you know what I mean, people generally don't talk about their own reproductive health, in the way that you might talk about, I cut my arm or I fell running or something like that. And I know it affects a huge amount of people in a very profound way, and it can make a lot of people's life very, very difficult. So you were working on treatments then for endometriosis, or trying to learn more about the condition. Is that correct?
Yes. Both, actually. Firstly, we were learning more about the condition because we were looking at the lesions and in the serum, for example, and we were quantifying or measuring certain molecules. And I had always, so we were understanding a bit more about the pathology. That is, the pathology is what contributes to the development of a disease. And that was quite well known, but we wanted to look at some molecules that might be important. And one of them was a molecule made by the epithelial cells very specifically, because they're a minority of cells in the lesion. In a manner analogous to a cancer tumour, the most cells in there will probably be stromal cells, some epithelial, some immune cells. It's a bit similar in a lesion. But we looked at that, and at the same time we were looking at a molecule that we hoped one day might be able to treat the disease, called lipoxin A4, or an analogue. This is a fat protein, a lipid that is anti-inflammatory. But by chance, we had discovered that it actually acted like a weak estrogen. So what happened was, when we put it together with estrogen, so if you imagine that the hormone is a key and the receptor to which it binds to exert its function to have an effect is a lock. The hormone is the key, the receptor is the lock, and the thing is, you've maybe one lock, but you've two keys, because we had lipoxin A4, lipoxin, and the estrogen.
Yes.
And lipoxin was competing with the estrogen to bind to the lock, okay? Only one thing can get in the keyhole. It's a very simplistic analogy. But we found that in cells, we looked at this marker, it's increased in endometriosis, but when we put when we added the lipoxin in to the endometriosis model in cells and in a mouse model of the disease, we saw that there was a diminishment of this molecule and other molecules involved in the stickiness of the cells, that they would proliferate, and those that cause inflammation. So it was a potential treatment, but it's very short-lived, so it breaks up quickly in the body, and that would have meant more research. So that was basically what the research was about. We were looking at samples from patients, we were looking at a cell line that we grew in the lab, and also we had developed a mouse model of endometriosis. And
I suppose that's an important qualification when it comes to research. It's not a case of, we found that now, job done, and we'll move on to the next problem. It's a process. It's all incremental. Because I'm sure, like you mentioned, it's not a solution, but it helps. And I'm sure you and other people around the world have taken that work and developed on it and will develop on it.
It has been developed on a little. I would have hoped it would have been more developed.
Okay.
And it's one thing I would love to be a part of, because novel therapies and better therapies are more effective with less side effects are really needed. But you're right. Research, by the virtue of the fact that it needs to be done rigorously and correctly,
yes,
can be slow. And it depends on the domain. It would be faster in an IT-related discipline probably than in the biological sciences. In the biological sciences, you'll have cells, samples from humans obtained correctly with consent of the patient, of course, and also animal models. But you need to reproduce things. Other people need to reproduce things. And that's why when we talked before about a publication that's peer-reviewed, ideally when you have your method section, your methodology in your publication, that should be sufficiently detailed so that it can be reproduced by another group, which is important because if we don't have another backup of that, how can we ever say we'll then go to clinical trials and test it in humans? It simply wouldn't be safe. So it's very true that research is incremental by its nature. It has to be, it should be, in order to protect the end user. But it's also, it's rigorous. So you're right there.
You mentioned a mentor, and you mentioned somebody who had a positive influence on your career. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that person and what happened?
Well, I met that person during a summer project, and this person encouraged me at a time when I wasn't sure where I was going to go, or I wasn't sure, is this for me? Can I do this? Do I have the ability? And yet I had a lot of curiosity. And that person saw that, because my fourth year project had sparked that curiosity, had sparked that interest in research and the questioning and the pathways and how things work and what happens after that, and, how can you best do that? So it was great. I appreciated that person because they encouraged me to look for a PhD, and I did. And then I started a PhD programme the following September. And that was very important for me. I would advise any student considering research to find, above all, someone to whom they can ask questions. A mentor in all career paths, research or regardless, is very important.
Because as I hear you speak, you're clearly very, very knowledgeable about your subject area. You know an awful lot about it. You've got great insight into it. But I'm sure if you were speaking to your undergraduate self, your undergraduate self wouldn't have had that knowledge. It's not like you came fully formed into the world. It is a development process.
Completely, Rob.
So it's not that you have to know. You don't have to know all the answers now. So the reason I'm saying that, somebody could be listening to this who maybe an undergraduate, may not be a student at all, maybe doing something else, thinking I couldn't get ever into research because I'm interested in biotechnology or immunology. Sure, I don't know anything about that, or I don't know anything about IT, or it could be a humanities discipline. It could be anything at all. You don't have to have all the answers now. That's the point, is that you don't have the answers.
That's the point. If we knew everything, why do research?
Exactly.
It's a journey of discovery and the generation of new knowledge that's useful for society in various domains. So my undergrad self, it was this fourth year research project that was a pivotal moment. But we learn and we develop all the time. Right now I'm reading a book that's very interesting, but it's not a book that I would have appreciated as a PhD student, because it's much broader and wider. And as we gain more experience, or as we, move away from research a little bit, in any case, our perspective broadens. And in a sense, one is moving away from a single discipline. In my last job, I was reviewing grants for not just immunology, biomedical sciences that I would have only done in a very specific field as a researcher, as an evaluator, but I was giving a technical review to projects in the social sciences and humanities as well. And that was very enriching. So what I mean by I'm on a journey, I'm so different now from who I was at undergraduate. It's, everyone's on a journey, and it's important to ask questions. And I would encourage, doing a fourth year project now, to consider a career in research. There are others, as I said, who are doing research part-time, but there are various options out there. Keep asking questions, stay curious.
Would you say that's the key skill of a good researcher, being curious?
It's a key skill, but it's true that nowadays we need to be rigorous. So we need to frame our questions to ask the right ones and to go about answering them in the right way, in order to have high quality data that really answers the question in the best way later. And I would say that perseverance and resilience is very important, because, you might be working on a new technique, you have to optimize it, you have to do it again. It can be frustrating. It's not easy. I would say it's very rewarding, but it's important to recognise that it takes hard work and perseverance, and it's not easy. You'll even applying for grant funding. We talked about funding for research earlier, and that's a key role of ours in the research support unit, and it's vital for everyone, people and institutions. But people often have to resubmit a grant. They don't get it the first time. They have to go back, they have to improve it, do it better, make improvements, and resubmit and get it. And sometimes they do that a few times. It's the same with experiments.
Yeah, there's my dad, who doesn't have any sort of an academic background at all, but he's got a great phrase that as I get older, I realise just how quite wise it is. And it's, if it was easy, everyone would do it.
Exactly.
So Geraldine, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for speaking with us today. If somebody wanted to find out more about you and the role that your current role as head of research in WIT, where should they go? What should they do?
Well, about me, I have a LinkedIn profile. So, it's professional networking. That shows my professional career path. There is a website for all the staff in the RIGS, the Research, Innovation and Graduate Studies office. I'm also involved with graduate studies and my profile is there. The Research Support Unit also has a very comprehensive website. So there's a section about postgraduates, there's a section about funded research projects, scholarships. You can also contact the Research Office for further information if you wish. The email address is research@wit.ie and we'd be glad to help you.
Geraldine Canny, thank you so much for speaking to us today as part of the 9 Plus podcast, and hopefully it will be the first of many appearances.
Thank you very much, Rob. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening all the way to the end of this podcast. If you'd like to learn more, we have lots of information published on wit.ie. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at 9pluspodcast. That's digit 9 PLUS podcast on Twitter. Finally, if you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a nice review on your preferred podcast listening platform. Thank you.